Hey guys, and welcome to the first video on Chapter 10, Classical Greece. Now, a bit about Greek geography. Greece is a peninsula. By the modern day borders of Greece, it would end up around here, around where Macedonia is. And it's a very irregularly shaped peninsula, but it's still a peninsula, still a landmass that juts out into the Mediterranean. You've got the larger Mediterranean Sea to the south and to the west. You've got the Aegean Sea here that separates Greece from what today would be Turkey. And then you've got this smaller body of water, the Sea of Crete. You've got a lot of islands as well down here, okay? All of these Greek islands, they're big tourist destinations now, but many of them, they associate themselves with, they associate themselves with Greek culture and were controlled by other Greek powers throughout the centuries. Also, as you start to get inland, it gets hilly and mountainous very quickly. Okay, so you've got a lot of mountains and you've got a lot of islands, two very important geographic concepts to remember about Greece. Now, early societies. There are two very early societies that I want to talk about here. The first one is the Minoan civilization. Right? This one is very old. This is going back about 4,000 years, about 2200 to 1700 BCE is when it was at its height. And this actually is not technically on the Greek peninsula. It was on that island of Crete that I showed you before. And a civilization built up here that dominated trade that came in and out of from the Mediterranean to the Aegean. And it built up a very, very thriving cosmopolitan culture. And it was centered around their capital, which had the Palace of Knossos. I never know how to pronounce it properly, if the K is fully silent or not. But in any event, Knossos, we know a bit about that from archaeological excavations. You're seeing one there today, and some of the really impressive frescoes that dotted the inside of the palace, dolphins, and bull dancing. Bull dancing was a very fascinating aspect of Minoan culture, where it was, similar to bull baiting, in Spanish and Mexican culture, where they would, leap on and off of, these huge animals. A lot of historians think that this also gave rise to the myth of the Minotaur, the Minos' bull that was at the center of his labyrinth, according to mythology. Now, who came after them were the Mycenaeans, or the Mycenaeans. About 1700, there were a series of natural disasters, earthquakes, and also a volcano that really kind of ended Crete's dominance over the trade world in the Aegean. And by that point, other groups were starting to become more prominent on the Greek peninsula itself. Now, we call this Mycenaean because of Mycenae as being one of the more prominent cities that was kind of excavated from that time period. Now, we don't know a whole lot in terms of written records that come directly from this time. More of it comes from epic poems and myths about it. But we do know that they were a warrior culture. And the epic poems and the myths, even though that they were recorded hundreds of years later, we know this from the main ones, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are attributed to the blind poet Homer. Now, here is a map of the Greek world, and as in relation to the city of Troy. The Trojan War, while it was very famous in mythology, there was an actual Trojan War where the Greek city-states kind of binded together and went to battle against Troy. Now, was it over Helen of Troy that you see down here because Paris kidnapped her, because it was promised to him after a wedding of the gods? No, it was a much more boring but also much more practical reason, and that was because of trade. You see where Troy is, and as you go through here, this narrow strait, that's the Strait of the Dardanelles. You control this, you control sea trade that goes from the Black Sea up through here, what today would be Istanbul and, used to be Constantinople, but way back before it was even Constantinople, this was a Greek city, Byzantium. We'll talk more about that later. Trade that comes through here out into the Aegean. Here's Troy. They controlled it, and the Greeks wanted a piece of that. So was there a Trojan War? Yes. Did you have all of these famous heroes like Odysseus and Hector fighting each other and gods getting involved? Well, I'm inclined to say no, and Achilles and so forth. But there was actual fighting. And the constant warfare that you saw from this time really destabilized the region and led Greece into a bit of a dark age for a couple of centuries. Now, they would emerge from this dark age as centers would begin to build up, known as polis or polis in the plural form of it. And polis is just a fancy term for city-states. Again, you look at a topographical map. All of the darker shaded areas, these are elevated areas, very mountainous. We talked about all of the islands before. These Greek city-states, they emerged as kind of independent identities from each other. They were not completely isolated in the sense that they had no relations. They spoke essentially the same language. They worshipped pretty much the same gods, but some of them in particular had very separate cultural identities. And the two ones that we always talk about are Sparta and Athens. So first, Sparta. Now, Sparta has become very well known in pop culture in recent years because of the movie 300, and everybody knows that it's got that warrior culture, right? And it wasn't just about being warriors. It was strict military culture, discipline. Young boys started training as young as 7 years of age, and they trained full time, up through, their teenage years, and then fully committed themselves to military service by the time they were 20. In fact, they weren't even allowed to live at home. They had to live in military barracks up until they were 30. Finally, after 30, they could go back to their wife and kids. You were allowed to marry and have kids. You just couldn't live with them full time. You would just see them occasionally and then go back to living in the barracks with the soldiers ready to fight in any given notice. And they put this very, very strict, kind of adherence on physical fitness. They did practice eugenics, where they would kind of discard babies that were thought to be physically inferior or unfit. Didn't happen all that often, but it did happen. And this even extended to the women. Spartan women were expected to be strong and fit, because then that would they would give birth to strong and fit babies after that. All right. Now, Sparta was from this area here, kind of the lower half of the peninsula, known as the Peloponnesus. Here's Sparta right there. A little tough to make out, but there they are. And they very much dominated the surrounding area. And while Sparta did not technically have slaves, the surrounding people that they dominated became known as helots. And while they weren't bought and sold as chattel, they could not do whatever they wanted. They were stuck to the land. It was very similar to serfdom, that you had in the Middle Ages, where you were basically bound to the land. And this strict adherence to military discipline, where they kind of shunned excessiveness and luxury and all that type of stuff, gave rise to this saying of a Spartan society, a Spartan existence, very bare bones, just trying to make rough, tough individuals and so forth. So Sparta was one. The other major city-state was Athens. Now, Athens originally... getting ahead of myself here. We learn about Athens being the birthplace of democracy and, kind of the cradle of democracy and so forth. But the reality was that it wasn't a true democracy because they very much restricted citizenship. Only males. You had to be landowning, at different times. That would change. But also they had slavery as well. So Athens was not this kind of bastion of freedom and liberty necessarily that it gets made out to be. But it is important to understand where democracy comes from. Now, originally, as I said, it was an aristocracy. And let me just show you where Athens is up here also. Okay, so there's Sparta, there's Athens. Originally, it was an aristocracy, as I said. Landowning nobles, they kind of controlled much of it. And this led to a huge, huge wealth disparity. It almost resulted in a civil war because the common classes became so resentful of the wealth that the aristocracy was building up. And a lot of it was coming from trade. You see where Athens is, and it's a port city. So you had all of these trade routes that were coming in and out. And not that many people were able to benefit from it. So, as I said, it had the potential to lead to a civil war. But eventually we know it as being a democracy. And the reason that it became a democracy and such a prominent democracy is largely because of two men. The first one is Solon. When the different social classes were at each other's throats, Solon was a reformer who stepped in and basically, formed a compromise between the two. He did make land reforms without taking all the land away from the aristocracy. But more important than that, he allowed much more government representation among the common classes. And this really set the seeds for democracy. All right, so there's Solon there. The guy who took it to new levels was the statesman Pericles. Pericles really expanded the idea of citizenship and representation. He, was a very well-known statesman and leader, and under his guidance, Athenian culture expanded and really kind of reached this golden age. Now, Greek colonies. The Greeks, as I said before, they didn't have a ton of farmland, because of so much of Greece being mountainous and small islands and so forth. So it really forced them to kind of go elsewhere and, settle, because it's not that big of an area and it wasn't capable of supporting large populations on the peninsula itself. And they did go all over the place. They turned the Aegean right here basically into a Greek lake, where the entire perimeter of it, including what used to be Troy, all dominated by Greece. And you've got this one up here, Byzantium. That's going to become very important later on. The perimeter of the Black Sea up here, all Greek. Areas in North Africa, the bottom part of the boot of Italy, including Sicily, even some areas in Spain and what today would be southern France. So they really got all over the place. Now, these colonies were all independent entities because there was no centralized Greek government. It wasn't like they were an empire sending people out the way that the British established colonies. If you were in Byzantium, you pretty much were on your own, but you still maintained a bit of a Greek identity, right? And the sense of Greek identity is going to come into play with their conflict against the Persians, which I will talk about in the next video.